Thanks so much to Scott for the conversation. To learn more about Scott, please check out the link in the podcast description of this episode. Here at Autism Personal Coach, our clients are the experts, our coaches are the guides. The majority of supports for autistics are not helpful. They try to fix us, not support us. That's why many are confused when we say our clients are the experts of their lived experience. Our clients are the experts for what has worked for them and about the things they need and want in their lives. Our coaches first listen to our clients, then ask thoughtful questions, offer resources, and strategize with our clients so they can get what they need to thrive. Would you want a guide in your life to coach you to get the things you desire? If so, then visit autismpersonalcoach.com for more information. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Autism Stories, and if you did, if you could tell a friend, foe, or anyone you know about it so they could have the same enjoyable and educational experience as you when listening to Autism Stories, it would be very much appreciated. Until next time, I'm Doug Bletcher of Autism Personal Coach. Talk to you then. Scott, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Doug. I really appreciate you reaching out to me.
Absolutely. And I'd love to learn, starting out with our conversation, where does your story in the autistic community begin?
Well, I guess you could say it began 51 years ago when I was born, but more specifically, I was a late identified autistic person. I learned about 3 years ago at age 48, and probably like most every other autistic person who was identified later in life, I never felt like I fit in anywhere. I always felt different and never knew why. But one evening, my wife and I were watching TV, and there's this show called The Employables. I don't know if you've ever saw that, but it's a reality TV show that the producers followed neurodivergent people in their attempt to find gainful employment. And every time they spotlighted an autistic person, I just really resonated with that person. I was like, that's me. Am I autistic? And so after a few episodes of watching that, I got curious and I started looking online for the various self-assessment quizzes you can take online, and they kept coming up that I'm probably autistic. And at that point, my wife didn't know any of this, and I shared with her my thoughts, and I sent her the link to one of the quizzes, and she took it as though she was me, and she knows me very, very well. And her score is actually higher than what I got. And so that kind of prodded me to, you know what, I really want to find out. It's not going to change anything about me, but the knowledge, it was just something I wanted to have. So I did some searching, found somebody who would assess me, a licensed psychologist who assesses adults. Long story short, I learned, yes, they confirmed I'm autistic. And so then I really got involved in learning what autism is all about, even though I came from a medical profession and thought I understood it. But then when I really started to read on my own and find the different online communities with actually autistic people and learning from their perspective, it really started to change a lot about what I thought I understood about autism, and kind of led me down the path of wanting to pay it forward, so to speak.
Now, currently you are a manager of credential maintenance and psychometrics. For those that might not be familiar with psychometrics, what the heck is that and what exactly do you do?
So that's the field of study that deals with conducting validity and reliability studies of different measurements. And in this case, we're talking about IT industry certifications. And me and my team, we do the work to maintain industry certifications to make sure the test is working as it should and doing all the math behind the scenes to assess its performance and make changes so that we're first and foremost being fair to anyone who takes our exams, and secondly to make sure that they're legally defensible and making sure that any sort of inferences and decisions we make about somebody based on this exam score is appropriate and accurate.
I've been following you for a while on LinkedIn, and the things that you
Thank
post,
you.
yeah, absolutely. And I've been following you because I think the things that you post really get my attention. Oftentimes social media posts are about people expressing their thoughts and feelings, and oftentimes those things are wonderful. However, you take a different approach and you ask a lot of reflective questions instead of kind of like giving your personal thoughts and feelings. Why do you decide to kind of take this approach to do something that I do here very much on Autism Stories, is ask a lot of questions?
I'm glad you asked that, Doug. So, going back to a year or two ago when I'm learning more about myself and being autistic in the autistic community, and really, really listening to others who have traveled this journey that I'm just starting, one of the things that kept bubbling up was this idea of infighting, meaning, we have autistic people within the community. I'm sure you've heard it, dealt with it, talked about it a bit, but where we have these differing perspectives, even though we're all autistic and we're all in the same community, we're all should be supporting one another, we're at each other's throats because what you see, Doug, and what I see may not be the same thing, but they're both our reality. And initially, I was also one of those folks, like he had said, let me share my perspective as I'm going through this journey. It's an outlet of sorts. But then it kind of dawned on me. I put my change management hat on and thought about this through an organization development approach. One of the things that was really missing, the critical thing that was missing, is people were not listening. We're so busy talking, we're not taking the time to listen to one another. And so instead of me just saying, here's what I believe, because that's only one out of how many millions of autistic people out there, I took the stance of, let me use something that I use in the classroom and I use in the change management work that I do. Ask questions. And I followed a simple mantra. First, seek to understand, then seek to be understood. It does a couple things for us. First, because I do believe that everyone's perspective is valid, that doesn't mean somebody's perspective is correct. That's a whole different argument. But everyone's perspective is valid. It's their reality. So who am I to say that's wrong, this is right? So by asking people, what do you think about this? Or what's your experience with this? What happens if we do this? What do you know about this? Number one, that gets them talking and me listening. But number two, it also creates a safe place to where people feel, making sure that everyone doesn't jump on each other. That's why I insist on making sure that it's a judgment-free zone, but it helps people feel comfortable in sharing those things. And if people feel comfortable sharing, they're going to feel more comfortable and are more receptive to listening themselves. So I suspend judgment. I want to hear other people's perspective because that influences my worldview. And I can take in what they're saying and going, okay, I see what you're saying. Here's my perspective. How do I make sense of all of this? It helps to create dialogue and not just discussion. And I think that's one of the things that is missing is we're not listening. We're not having those dialogues. We're too busy putting our stake in the ground saying, this is correct. Yes, it is, but it's correct for you. But what about for others?
And you mentioned about a safe place. I think safety is something that as autistics we all are seeking.
Yes.
And I don't think, I think we're seeking that because we're looking for community, we're looking for connection. And if we don't have safety, then I don't know how we can achieve that. So I'm wondering, by asking others about their experiences and thoughts, um, how that might have helped you to develop community and connection through on LinkedIn.
It goes back to what you had just said. When people feel safe, or at least safer, they are more willing to share. And I think just naturally, people like to share what they're experiencing. They like to share their thoughts. People want to feel a value. And by giving somebody else the platform, by asking somebody else their perspective, I'm creating that safe place and really fostering that dialogue. I think one of the things that helps connect every person on earth is being curious. We can have different perspectives on something, but if I'm curious about your perspective, you're more likely to reciprocate and be curious about my perspective as well, or at the very least be more open to it. And over time, people become more and more open to it by focusing on those commonalities, primarily being, let's be curious about different things and suspend that judgment and listen to perspectives. We gain trust with one another, and people are more willing to open up to different perspectives.
I think that's such an important point, being curious. Like, I am constantly curious. Like, there will never be enough answers for me not to be curious, I think, in this physical experience. So
Absolutely.
I'm wondering about that curiosity. I know you talked a little bit about, like, through work you were used to asking questions and things like that. Has that curiosity has always been there, or was it like kind of developed? So is it natural just to
Um,
you as Scott, or was it a skill you developed?
I would say it's both. I think as if I reflect back on my childhood, which was a very long time ago, I remember in high school, I was taking a jewelry class, much my high school career. And I remember my a teacher would share a concept, and I would be curious about, okay, if that works in this situation, how can I make it work here? And I'd tinker around until I got it right. And from a very young age, I remember having that. But as I get older, especially as I went into grad school in particular, where it's not just about remembering facts, but about that structured inquiry. Uh, that is definitely a skill, especially at the PhD level, definitely is a skill that you learn and refine. And ever since then, I've tried to continuously refine that.
So when we ask questions, I've learned that, especially here on Autism Stories, we've had like 260 episodes or so, that
Yes.
you might get answers that you don't expect. So I'm curious, for you, with asking all these questions on LinkedIn, have there been some specific responses that have really resonated with you, or made you kind of look at life a little bit differently?
So, yes, is the short answer. I'm trying to think of some specific ones that made me really stop and think. Like just today, for example, I had posted something about, instead of emphasizing building autistic children's verbal speaking communication, why don't people emphasize sign language communication abilities? And somebody had posted, you know, if somebody has this going on, it would affect their ability to learn sign language just like it would verbal language. And that made me think, wow, now I need to look into that, learn a little bit more. But the other thing that kind of comes to my mind, and this goes to the power of Socratic questioning and really wanting to learn and understand others' values, beliefs, and assumptions. One question that I posted about a year ago, and I think it was about whether autistic people should listen, autistic people who oppose applied behavioral analysis, should we listen to people's perspectives who support applied behavioral analysis? And one person was dead set on no, we should not. And so my follow-up questions with that person in a very short amount of time, 3 turns, I think it was, 3 back and forth turns of messages, that person went from an absolute no to, I'll have to think about that a little more. And that is a prime example of why I do what I do, is because people really will stop to think about another's perspective if they feel they're in a safe place to listen. And it changed the conversation.
You've taken things a step further with all these questions as you're creating a book with all of these questions in them. Can you tell us a little bit about this book and when is it going to be available for the public?
So, yes, I took the questions that I posed most of last year, and with that, I kind of grouped them into 6 broad categories, but they're not like mutually exclusive. There's, because the nature of the questions that I asked, there's a lot of interrelationship, but I kind of grouped them into 6 broad areas, and it's just a list of the questions. And so that comprises 6 of the 10 chapters of this book. And at the end of those, each chapter of questions, I have some reflective questions and a here, now try this. And so some call for action based on that section. But the other 4 chapters, the first chapter of the book, I actually talk about my journey from being formally identified as an autistic person through to being an advocate. And then the last 3 chapters, chapter 8, talks about that all perspectives are valid. And I kind of go into detail about why that is and why thinking that way actually helps bolster our narrative and our voices. Chapter 9, I share my conception of neurodiversity across all of humanity, not just a subset of humanity, and talk about those things that we all experience internally, we experience externally, and those things that we need for supports to actually survive as people, and kind of reframe this idea of neurodiversity as a relation of these 3 constructs. And then finally, my last chapter, chapter 10, talks about rethinking what we see as supporting not only autistics, but just any person, rethinking reframing how we look at disability in general, and then also how we can reframe or take a different approach, similar to what I have, around advocating for autistic folks. And so this book, I'm in the very last stages of making my revisions, and it'll be published later this year, hopefully by the fall, but we'll see how things go. And it's going to be published by Accessibility Publishing, which is out of the Mind Your Autistic Brain organization.
Carol Whittington, yes.
Yes.
Yep.
She actually wrote the foreword to my book, and I'm very honored that she did.
A previous guest here on Autism Stories.
Yes. Yeah. Great person.
There's something that I'm interested in that I heard recently that you're involved in is generative AI to have, and I guess you've gotten involved in it for the purpose of having dialogues about autism, the autistic experience. So from what I understand, you have used the, I guess, very popular now, ChatGPT.
Yes.
Based on your reflective questions that you have created. What have you learned how effective ChatGPT can be to have these conversations about autism?
So maybe to kind of preface this, some of the ways that I do use ChatGPT, I do use generative AI in my professional world as well, but focusing just on this, I'll use it to help kind of generate some ideas about what kind of questions do I want to write. I'll write every one of my questions myself, but it can be very helpful in thinking about, what kind of areas to focus on. I also use it to bounce my ideas off of. So like when I think about this relational model for example, or trying to think of a different way to reframe autistic interactions, for example, I'll kind of put my thoughts into ChatGPT and ask it questions about, does this make sense? What other theories does this relate to? Kind of be that trusted advisor that I can talk to and get some feedback on my work without having to include other people. I've even had full conversations where we're just going back and forth talking. In the autistic world, we think of that as rehearsing or scripting for a conversation, but instead of writing it down, I actually interact with this artificial intelligence, that's actually really cool, especially when you're trying to debate with ChatGPT and convince them of your perspective. Kind of setting up, you take this perspective, I'll take this perspective, and trying to convince artificial intelligence that yours is a correct one. I use it to explore ideas from multiple perspectives, and the good thing is it's not so value and emotion laden that the conversation doesn't get sidetracked or derailed altogether. So yeah, those are some of the ways that I've used it. I'll also pose the questions that I do put on LinkedIn and have it answer, and then I'll share those as well. And sometimes it comes up with things that I have never thought of before in response. I'm like, okay, here's something I need to go dig into a little bit more.
And Scott, beyond this interview, how can our listeners learn more about you?
Obviously, I'm on LinkedIn. You can just look up Scott Frasard, and you can find me there. And I've recently decided and have created a Facebook page called A Reflective Question to Ponder, which is also the title of my book. But feel free, and I'm a very small page there right now, but I hope to grow it. So feel free to check that out as well.
Well, I will continue to follow you on LinkedIn. I was not aware about the Facebook page, so I will be joining that today.
Well, thank you. I just recently created it. I haven't publicized it really, so I'm working on it.
Well, thanks so much for your time, Scott. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you, Doug. I enjoyed it as well. Thank you for having me on.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Autism Stories. I'm your host, Doug Bletcher, the founder of Autism Personal Coach. Autistic people are the true experts of the autistic experience, and Autism Stories is where we interview autistic people to learn from their stories, experiences, and get their insights. If you'd like to be notified about each week's episode of Autism Stories, we suggest you subscribe on your favorite podcast listening platform. We would also appreciate it if you could give us a positive rating and review, as it will help others to learn about autism stories. I don't really understand much about this world, so it's really important for me to ask questions. Otherwise, I am not going to understand so much, and life is going to be that much harder for me. That's why I'm excited to talk with Scott Frasard on today's episode as we discuss the importance of asking questions, psychometrics, and using ChatGPT to have discussions about autism. We hope you enjoyed today's conversation.